Chapter 4. By noon, the entire household knew exactly where Madelyn had been stung. It was a spectacular feat, she supposed, taking into account the vastness of the castle.
"You must consider the fact that there are hundreds of servants,"
Charlotte said, following Madelyn across her bedchamber.
"Certainly enough to keep a steady wave of gossip flowing strong."
Yes, but if I encounter another giggling Fairborn twin, or one more well-meaning servant armed with a secret smile, and another poultice for wasp stings, I'm leaving.
Madelyn plucked a small blue pillow from her bed, fluffed it, then placed it atop the cushioned bench at the foot of her bed.
"But you mustn't go,"
Charlotte cried, removing the pillow before Madelyn could sit on it and tossing it back upon the bed.
"Remember your agreement with your stepmother."
She pointed to the blue and yellow striped chaise lounge across the room.
"You'll be infinitely more comfortable there."
Madelyn nodded.
It wasn't an agreement, it was blackmail.
She shuffled over, gingerly settling down on her side, her head resting on the curved arm.
"Still, you must pretend to try and snag the Duke. And Priscilla shan't believe you are, based on what happened when we arrived."
Then perhaps I'll simply find the castle's dungeon and hide in it for the next 14 days. Oh, Charlotte, I'm positively mortified.
Charlotte, deciding to sit on the lounge near Madelyn's feet, was bent halfway down to sit when her dark blue eyes grew wide. She bolted across the room, catching her dozing mother's empty teacup just before it hit the floor.
"I don't think Wolverest has a dungeon any longer,"
she said, settling the cup back on the tray on a nearby table.
"But really, how in the world does addressing His Grace improperly outshine falling into a pond and exposing yourself?"
She paused, sticking out her own nearly flat chest.
"I mean, revealing yourself, Madelyn."
Nonsense. I had a blanket.
A blanket that kept gaping open.
Madelyn groaned.
Ugh. Thank you for pointing out that added facet of my humiliation. At least the deceiver pretended not to notice.
Your deceiver noticed, all right. His gaze dropped down every time you blinked.
Madelyn sat up, her backside aching with a knot of pain.
He's certainly not mine,
she said, patting the loose bun atop her head, still damp from her bath.
And I don't believe you.
You should,
Charlotte said.
I observe everything.
She turned, studying her napping mother for a moment, then looked at Madelyn with a cheeky grin.
I've something to show you.
Reaching inside the front of her bodice, she pulled out a folded sheet of paper.
What have you there?
Madelyn asked. Unfolding the paper as if it was made of spun sugar, Charlotte held it directly beneath her nose, her eyes skimming the lines.
It is a list of Lord Tristan's favourite things.
Wherever did you get that?
Myself.
She smiled proudly at Madelyn.
Through careful observations, not to mention heavy eavesdropping, I concluded several of his lordship's predilections. I made a list and I've been studying it.
Charlotte, I'm amazed.
Her friend's playful expression turned doubtful.
Do you think it's strange?
Absolutely.
Charlotte tried to sigh with vexation but smiled instead.
Well, I figured it couldn't hurt. Would you like to hear them?
Madelyn smiled at her friend's show of remarkable trust. Anyone but Charlotte would hoard such vital information, disbelieving her claim to dislike Lord Tristan. But not Charlotte. They had an unbreakable bond sewn in childhood on threads of unconditional love and a mutual obsession with snooping about, books, and anything covered in, baked with or drizzled over with chocolate. Besides, they both had a family member who criticised them to excess. Only they each handled it differently. Madelyn pretended the barbs didn't hurt, while Charlotte constantly altered herself.
Yes, please, read on,
Madelyn said.
Words cannot express the extent of my interest.
Charlotte raised a sceptical brow before reading aloud.
His favourite colour is red. His favourite fruit is strawberries.
Charlotte paused, her nose scrunched up as she squinted to read the next line.
His favourite flower is the papadi. No, oh goodness, I've forgotten the pronunciation. The pahipo. No, that doesn't sound right either. Oh, I've got it. The Pythiopedilum orchid.
Looking mightily pleased, Charlotte smiled briefly to herself, then her pale brows knitted in thought.
Whatever do you suppose that looks like?
I have no idea.
Madelyn commented with a grimace as she tried in vain to find a more comfortable sitting position.
But I'm willing to wager 5 young women will be wearing them in their hair at dinner this evening.
Charlotte's face fell.
Do you really think so?
Madelyn smiled, finally settling in.
No, but I do think you'll positively go blind if you insist on not wearing your spectacles.
About that.
Charlotte looked down, her tone turning glum. She began twirling a pale coil of hair around her finger.
Harriet told me Lord Tristan doesn't like spectacles on women. She said that she overheard him say so at the Atkinsons' ball last spring, that they make a woman look older than she is and intelligent.
She mumbled that last part.
And he considers intelligence a flaw? Charlotte, why would you seek the interest of a man who—
Don't be silly, Madelyn.
Priscilla broke in.
A man like his lordship deserves whatever his heart desires.
She nudged Madelyn's foot as she walked past her to stand beside Charlotte.
How did you get in here?
Madelyn asked, since she hadn't seen or heard her door open. Priscilla peered over Charlotte's shoulder, her eyes darting over the sheet of paper she was holding.
Our chambers share a dressing room. Besides, I have a key.
But I don't even have a key.
Her stepmother's shrewd gaze lifted briefly to meet Madelyn's.
Of course you don't. Lady Rosalind presented all the chaperones with the key to our own room and our ward's rooms so we might lock you in at night, to ensure the obvious propriety and safety.
The fact that Priscilla said might lock you in didn't slip past Madelyn. Priscilla shrugged.
You can't get out, and obviously no one can get in unless they have the key.
Throwing a hand to her throat, Charlotte gasped with masked delight.
Ha! Even his own sister believes Lord Tristan would ravish us in our very beds.
Exactly,
Priscilla agreed.
Lady Rosalind assured us there was only one key for each room. And more importantly, my lady has informed all the chaperones that anyone caught outside their bedchamber without proper escort after midnight will be swiftly eliminated.
Reaching out, Priscilla snatched the sheet Charlotte was holding.
Tell me where you obtained this paper.
'Tis mine,
Charlotte answered, looking like she feared that Priscilla just might lunge across the space between them and bite her on the hand.
I can't see how any of this scribbled nonsense is going to help you.
Priscilla scoffed. Madelyn stole a glance at the newly awakened Mrs. Green sitting in a chair across from the fireplace. Charlotte's mother had demonstrated a rather remarkable hold on her temper, having been forced to witness Priscilla's catty impertinence in such close proximity in the past few days. However, if the pinched set of her lips were any indication, Mrs. Green's restraint was at its limit.
Humph,
Priscilla said haughtily, pulling Madelyn's attention back to her.
just out of curiosity, of course, has anyone made a list of the Duke's favourite things?
The room fell silent.
I don't believe so.
Charlotte offered finally.
And why would they? He isn't taking a bride.
She looked to Madelyn, giving her a slight "what else was I supposed to say" shrug. The Baroness's keen eyes skimmed the page, making short work of the list. She then crumbled it up, tossed it to the floor and rounded her attention on Madelyn.
There are things of which we must discuss. Things I wasn't aware of until today. We must have a chat.
Her frigid blue eyes widened momentarily as she attempted to stress the point. Madelyn knew what her stepmother wanted. Priscilla was very likely ready to explode with curiosity as to how and why it seemed she had met the Duke prior to coming to Wolverest. As far as her stepmother knew, Mr. Ashton had been successful in hunting her down in the garden, and that she, having been intercepted by her stepmother in the hall across from the kitchens, missed her introduction to the Duke with the other invitees. There was a knock on the door and Madelyn arose from the cushioned bench with care for her backside.
I imagine it's Jenny with another compress for the sting,
she said, shuffling across the room. She opened the door, revealing the maid. The girl bounced a quick curtsy.
Yes?
Madelyn asked.
His Grace expresses his interest in your welfare and desires your immediate company in the orangery.
Madelyn's eyes narrowed. Priscilla sidled up to her, whispering in her ear.
What a boon.
The Baroness then smiled wickedly down at Jenny, whose pallor turned positively ashen before she shrank back.
Well, what are you waiting for, girl? Take us to him.
His Grace specified Miss Haywood was to come alone.
Alone, is it?
Priscilla turned her back to the maid momentarily to smile smugly at Madelyn.
Well then, by all means, hurry along.
She tried scooting Madelyn out the door by tugging on her elbow.
Why?
Madelyn asked, her limp arm held captive in her stepmother's grasp.
Pardon, miss.
Did His Grace disclose the reason for his request?
For your interview.
Jenny responded gently.
The Master and Lady Rosalind mean to have interviews with all of his lordship's prospective brides. You are the first.
Madelyn pulled her arm loose.
Tell him.
She paused, tapping one finger on her chin in thought.
Tell him I've a headache and I acknowledge his concern. Perhaps we'll speak another time.
Are you sure, miss?
The poor maid looked as if she was already dreading the message she'd have to relate.
Quite.
Madelyn waited for Jenny to leave, then tried to quietly shut the door, but Priscilla stopped her short by jamming her foot inside before it could close.
Wait!
Priscilla called out to the maid before turning back to Madelyn.
Are you mad? You barely escaped from insulting him at his dinner party by running away from an invitation. You address him improperly in front of his guests, argue with him, and now you shun his request to see you? Have you lost your mind, child?
Madelyn thought about it for a second.
I think so.
Rubbing her temples, she moved to step around her stepmother.
Where do you think you're going?
Priscilla matched her stride.
You're to march straight to his grace and beg his forgiveness.
I certainly will not.
She answered incredulously. Priscilla came to an abrupt stop, one corner of her mouth pulling into a smirk.
And what of poor Charlotte? You would have her chances of winning Lord Tristan reduced by being so closely associated with an ungrateful, rude blue-stocking such as yourself?
Madelyn looked at Charlotte, who sat, brows furrowed, struggling to straighten out the wrinkles in the list Priscilla had so carelessly thrown to the floor. She sighed. Charlotte had harboured a schoolgirl's affection for Lord Tristan. Ever since that day, the Greens' carriage tipped over when their horse became spooked by an irate street vendor. His lordship had freed them from the twisted vehicle and even managed to settle their horse with expert hands and a bit of whispering. That was 5 years ago, and the girl's cap had been set for Lord Tristan ever since. Charlotte was vulnerable and quiet, certainly not the sort of young lady Lord Tristan was known to consort with. He'd bring her gentle friend to tears in no time, and the coxcomb didn't deserve her tears. But Charlotte's mind couldn't be swayed. She fancied herself in love with him. This was a dream come true, a chance to win the man of her dreams, her hero. Madelyn couldn't force her friend to see the lecherous rake for who he truly was, but she knew she could do everything within her power to steer the wolf away. And she couldn't very well protect Charlotte if the Duke sent her packing for her blatant impertinence. Swallowing her pride like a swig of sour milk, she glanced at a smug-looking Priscilla.
I'll go. I'll behave. But I will not beg if he chooses to send me home.
Now that's a good girl,
Priscilla chirped, patting her on the hand. She leaned in, whispering,
We must get you out of this horrid brown frock you chose to wear and get you into something more appealing. Something of mine, perhaps.
But everything of yours is too small.
Madelyn pointed out, following her stepmother as she waltzed toward the dressing room. Turning, Priscilla smiled like a hungry cat.
Exactly.
Why did I listen to that woman and not bring my shawl?
Madelyn asked no one in particular. She hugged her arms around herself, following Jenny to the orangery by way of a narrow brick path bordered on both sides with low hedges. A sudden burst of wind took Madelyn by surprise. She gasped as the cold air shot straight through the thin, peach-coloured jaconet dress. Jenny looked over her shoulder, giving her a sympathetic smile. Shivering, Madelyn looked down at the dress she had unwillingly borrowed from Priscilla. She tried to quell the wicked feeling of being a juicy morsel about to wander into the woods, all to lure a wolf for her avaricious stepmother. Indeed, it would have been fitting if she had brought a shawl, Madelyn mused, or a cape, a nice red one with a hood. Her arms covered with goose pimples, they rounded a bend and finally reached the orangery, which Madelyn noted was 4 times as big as their home in Chelsea. They stepped inside the south-facing building and were instantly enveloped with warmth and the cheery scent of orange blossoms.
My word.
She remarked in awe as Jenny led her down a tiled path in the middle of orange and lemon trees.
It's a veritable forest. There must be 400 of them.
377 to be exact,
Came a husky feminine voice ahead. A beautiful woman closer to the Duke's age than Madelyn's stepped out from behind a silk screen and smiled warmly at Madelyn. Her hair was glossy black, just like the Duke, but her round blue eyes revealed a sweet softness, unlike her eldest brother's frosty azure.
Lady Rosalind.
Madelyn curtsied.
Miss Haywood,
Lady Rosalind returned.
come quickly. Let us sit and talk by the fountain.
Dismissing Jenny, she linked her arm with Madelyn's and walked around the silk-covered screen used to separate a seating area from the rest of the large room. On the other side sat a pair of ornate garden chairs situated next to a fountain with 2 opposite-facing fish at its centre. With care for her bottom, Madelyn took a seat, instantly feeling the fabric tighten around her chest. She folded her hands demurely in her lap, all the while fretting whether the seam under her bust would hold out. With her luck, her dress would bust open the very moment Mr. Devine, no, His Grace, walked into the room.
Tea?
Lady Rosalind gestured to the tea tray set out on a nearby table.
No, thank you.
Madelyn replied. Her throat was dry, but her stomach was doing strange flip-flops at the prospect of encountering the Duke at any minute.
I can see you're nervous, and I don't blame you, or any of the ladies for that matter. My oldest brother isn't the sort of man who inspires one to feel at ease. And, naturally, as all of you are trying to impress him for Tristan's sake, I thought, since your interview was first, I'd talk with you before my brother joins us.
I don't understand.
Madelyn said, perplexed. She had harboured the thought her interview was first, so she could be either properly chastised or eliminated because of that morning's event. But Lady Rosalind seemed unaware of her recent social blunders.
You see,
Lady Rosalind replied, looking over her shoulder as if making sure no one was near.
my brother, he can appear rather cold and arrogant. Please do not be led by your first impression.
Do not indeed. In the garden, Madelyn believed Gabriel Devine to be an agreeable man, equipped with a sincere concern for her welfare. The only fault in his possession at the time was that he oft stood too close, though even that wasn't so horrible. But she'd been wrong. Now she lumped him together with all the other pompous aristocrats of her acquaintance.
It might help you to know.
Lady Rosalind paused with apparent indecision about her thread of conversation.
Underneath that facade, I believe, a heart in need of...
She stopped, shaking her head sadly, tenderness for her brother heavy in her gaze.
I suppose it isn't at all fair of me to speak of his private feelings. However, I do feel pressed to explain his reserved nature, in hopes to forestall any imagined slights by his lack of presence for the next 2 weeks. Other than this interview, one might never lay eyes on him again until the night of the ball.
Forgive me, my lady, but I fear your advice has come too late.
Madelyn sighed softly. Perhaps the Duke would hesitate about sending her away if she explained the situation to his friendly sister first, winning her compassion. She took a deep breath and continued.
I met His Grace back in London at the dinner party.
Oh, yes.
Lady Rosalind replied, nodding.
I remember. My brother spotted you from his study.
She leaned in, her exotic eyes showing keen interest.
He went after you, didn't he?
Yes, well, basically, but I don't believe I made a good first impression.
Pish! My brother spied you in the garden, Miss Haywood, and insisted I invite you, unaware that I already had.
Really?
Madelyn asked, her curiosity stirred. Lady Rosalind nodded.
To be sure, I have a mind to think...
She stopped and shook her head.
Nevertheless, I'm sure whatever you did was overlooked. You were invited beside the point.
I accidentally threw a lemon at him.
Madelyn blurted.
Ha!
Lady Rosalind's mouth fell open.
You didn't!
Yes, knocked him square in the forehead, I'm afraid. But I didn't know it was him, and he didn't bother to
That's what the mark on his forehead is from? He told me. Oh dear.
The look of surprise in her eyes was quickly replaced with a flicker of anger.
He didn't try. That is to say, there weren't any untoward advances, were there?
Madelyn shook her head.
It was dark. I didn't know who it was, so you see...
Oh my.
And with that, Lady Rosalind leaned back in her seat, her dark head thrown back as laughter overtook her.
There. You... Goodness.
She tried to speak, but fits of giggles kept bursting forth.
I can't tell you how many times... Knock some sense into him. I hope...
Her laughter crumbled away and she wiped the tears from her eyes with the trim on her gloves.
Thank you. Oh, you are precious.
Madelyn didn't know what sort of reaction to expect from the Duke's sister, but hysterical laughter was definitely not one of them.
Good afternoon, Miss Haywood.
The Duke's deep, rich voice broke in as he walked around the screen. Lady Rosalind cleared her throat, pulling herself together with surprising quickness. The sunlight shining through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls made the Duke's obsidian hair positively gleam. He was dressed impeccably in a dark blue jacket and matching waistcoat, his snow-white cravat tied in a gentle cascade. The dark, almost exotically handsome man radiated affluence, confidence, and effortless charm. He looked precisely like someone who would by no means ever find someone like her appealing. Suddenly overwhelmed with a nagging inadequacy, Madelyn shifted in her ill-fitted gown. Whoever thought she'd do well as a candidate for the Bride of Devine was sorely mistaken. The Duke pointed to a nearby lemon tree without removing his ice-blue gaze from her.
I trust you are unarmed?
Madelyn nodded, ignoring his deliberate taunt. Lady Rosalind made a choking sound at the same time. Her lips were pressed together tightly and her eyes shut, as if she was severely concentrating on not laughing.
Rosalind,
the Duke said, glaring down at his sister with one dark eyebrow raised.
the event sheets.
She cleared her throat delicately.
We discussed this earlier and decided I'm handing them out after dinner.
I would like them now. Would you ask Miss Sparrow to retrieve them?
I dismissed her just.
Her eyes narrowed.
She must have passed you on your way in.
Then please, see to it yourself. I'd like to speak with Miss Haywood alone.
Lady Rosalind's gaze swung from her brother to Madelyn and back again.
You'd like me to leave you both alone?
Yes.
Here.
A muscle in his cheek twitched.
Would you have me state the obvious?
Lady Rosalind worked her jaw.
You are aware of how improper this is. You risk jeopardizing her reputation, Gabriel. We have promised the chaperones the strictest propriety.
Miss Haywood is certainly safe with me.
He intoned, looking down at his sister like he was ready to toss her out himself.
And no one needs to know.
Still,
Leave.
I think...
Now.
Lady Rosalind stood, giving Madelyn an apologetic smile.
Miss Haywood, if you would please call me Rosalind. You are simply delightful. Oh, I almost forgot. I'd like to commission your most desired services. I'd fancy you to present each female guest with her framed silhouette before the night of the ball. Your accuracy is stunning.
Madelyn returned her smile, pleased at how friendly and pleasant the Duke's sister turned out to be. So very unlike her brothers.
Of course,
She said.
it would be my pleasure. And please, you must call me Madelyn.
The Duke's sister nodded with a smile, giving Madelyn's arm a little squeeze as she passed. With that, she left them alone. The room fell silent, and the insufferable man continued to stand there, staring down at her. She looked everywhere but at him. One would think a duke would be aware of how impolite it was to stare. Her nose twitched as the alluring, woodsy scent of his shaving soap wafted through the air between them. His dark presence was nearly overwhelming in the bright atmosphere of the orangery. The air suddenly felt stuffy, her dress too tight, the room too quiet. Just when she thought she couldn't take the silence any longer, he spoke.
There needn't be any animosity between you and me.
Madelyn took a breath to speak, but her mind was uncharacteristically blank. Being the sole object of his attention was unsettling. She shifted in her seat, one side of her tender bottom throbbing. Part of her wanted to crawl under her chair and cower, and another part wanted to stomp on his foot for being such a rascal. Both actions, she decided, were childish, so she sat there, clasping her hands tightly in her lap, hoping her eyes wouldn't betray her thoughts.
I will speak of this now and never again,
He said.
That evening in London I was only thinking of averting your initial embarrassment. I realise now that I was only delaying it.
Her brow furrowed.
I don't understand.
Come, Miss Haywood. Surely you recall. You did not know who I was. You spoke of me with such venom, such disgust. You called me arrogant and... What was the other?
Cork-brained,
I don't recall.
she muttered, shrugging innocently.
In any case,
His eyes sized her up, contradicting his next words.
the gentleman in me couldn't bear your mortification should you realise at that moment the very man you expressed such abhorrence for was, in fact, standing before you.
I can assure you.
Madelyn expressed calmly.
Embarrassment is something I would have preferred to suffer in front of only you instead of a score of people.
Your point is made.
He bowed his head slightly. Pulling her lips together thoughtfully, she supposed that was about as close to an apology as she'd ever receive. Flipping the tails of his coat out of the way, he occupied his sister's empty seat. Leaning back, he entwined his long fingers like a basket across his flat stomach. His lean, muscled legs stretched out before him. He looked her square in the eye and her heart felt like it jumped to her throat. Here comes the elimination, she thought.
I believe you.
He said.
You believe what?
You do not want any part of this.
He stated.
And I certainly did not want you to be either. But by some scrap of mercifulness on my part, here you are. Certainly not as attractive as the others and glaringly unfit. But somehow I find you deserve a chance.
His bold snobbery almost made her laugh.
I thought.
You thought you were summoned here to be eliminated.
He finished for her.
Am I, Your Grace?
Gabriel thought the girl looked ready to scream or cry. Either one, he didn't like the way she so obviously felt ill at ease in his presence. Inwardly, he told himself it was a mistake to trust this one, but in truth, he did believe the chit. Certainly, he wouldn't absolve her person of any possible future transgression, but hell, after what happened today at the pond. Only an imbecile would doubt her motive. Leave it to his sister to pick the one woman who wanted nothing to do with Tristan. He studied her until she squirmed in her seat, which he knew must be painful considering recent events.
No, you're not eliminated.
A knowing smile played upon his lips.
You'll not escape that easily.
Escape? I have no idea what you're talking about.
She answered, her coral-coloured lips pursing in a charmingly thoughtful manner.
No? You informed me in London that you do not wish to marry a Devine. Your incident this morning in the pond only proved to me how desperately you want out.
I will not pretend to misunderstand, but I didn't jump into the pond in the hopes to be eliminated. I tripped. I had been stung by a bee.
Yes, you had said as much.
Her suspicious gaze studied his face as she worked something over in her mind. Gabriel tried to remain cool, detached, to hide his grin, but failed miserably.
Who told you where I was stung?
She blurted out, accusation flaring in her eyes.
The maid.
I asked her not to tell anyone.
Don't blame the poor girl. She's paid to listen to me, not you. I asked. I was told. Which reminds me.
He reached into his pocket and pulled out a key.
Press this to your affected area. It should take away the swelling and numb the pain.
A key?
She blushed prettily.
You're jesting.
Quite serious, I'm afraid.
He shrugged.
My grandmother insisted it worked when I was a child, though I've never managed to be stung on such a delicate area.
He held it out to her.
It's worth a try.
Madelyn eyed his offering skeptically. It might work, she mused. But then again, she'd be shamefully thinking of him while pressing it to her bottom in the privacy of her room. Or worse, she'd be thinking of him, thinking of her pressing it to her bottom in the privacy of her room.
No, thank you. I'll suffer in silence.
He shrugged again, dropping it back into his pocket.
Do you know, Miss Haywood, you have something none of the other ladies possess.
Pray, what is that?
My attention.
Gabriel felt a surge of satisfaction at the surprise in her gaze.
You are an enigma to me. Here in your hands lies the opportunity to marry far above your station. A marriage that would not only offer you all the comforts of life and social acceptance imaginable, but a marriage to a young, handsome,
He paused, withholding the word immature.
well-connected man.
And a man who clearly doesn't have the capacity to cherish a woman's heart. At least not yet, anyway.
Why do you run?
I told you.
She said.
I do not wish to marry.
At all?
She kept her silence, dropping her uneasy gaze to her lap.
One might propose the same question to you. You're still young, a duke no less. Why do you shun marriage, shirk your responsibilities, and let them fall to your brother?
No one will ever accuse you of holding your tongue.
He drawled, his eyes dropping to her mouth. He allowed his gaze to linger there, only until he felt a surprising twinge of desire. He then focused on her round brown eyes and realized the action did nothing to dissolve the feeling.
Perhaps I have not a woman of my acquaintance who can hold my attention longer than a day.
He continued, a bit too sharply.
Perhaps my requirement of perfection in a woman is so high that it is unfeasible to imagine she even exists. Or perhaps it is only that I would not enjoy surrendering my mistress.
At the stunned look on her face, he couldn't bear to taunt her any longer.
I'm teasing, Miss Haywood. You needn't look so chagrined.
You misinterpret my thoughts, Your Grace. Why would I care about your mistress or mistresses? I only returned the same question asked of me. I certainly haven't a care for your personal matters.
She looked him in the eye.
After all, I'm not here to win your affections.
Gabriel ignored a twinge of annoyance at her response.
I see we understand one another. You and all the others reside within these walls for the single purpose of competing for my brother. Your presence means little else.
That's perfectly plain. There's no reason for you to explain.
After today, one would be hard-pressed to set eyes on me for the next 2 weeks.
She surprised him with a bright smile.
Why ever would you condescend?
Exactly.
He shifted in his seat.
I imagine you have many important tasks to attend, duties to uphold, why you might even see fit to leave.
She smiled sweetly, a blasted dimple creasing in her cheek.
Quite right.
He rubbed his chin distractedly.
It is not as if I am looking for a bride, of course.
Of course.
She echoed, looking more at ease every passing second. So then why was he feeling steadily more vexed? Damn it all, she really was quite pretty, Gabriel thought, while watching her pretend to be comfortable. Her burgundy hair was pulled into a loose topknot, and he found himself wondering how in the world the maid managed to tame all her glorious red curls into such simple elegance. She sighed, bringing his attention to her bosom. There, her skin was pinkish, flushed. He couldn't help but notice that her breasts, again, nearly burst over the square neckline. The gown was obviously too small, and he wondered why the Baroness would choose to stuff her curvy ward in such a gown. Perhaps to attract Tristan's attention. Miss Haywood might not fancy herself a bride, but that said nothing of her stepmother's aspirations. He cleared his throat in an attempt to clear his head.
I must warn you of 2 things, Miss Haywood. First, I expect as little trouble from you as possible from this moment on.
I'm afraid I have to disappoint you once again. Misfortune follows me everywhere.
And when was that?
When was what?
She asked, blinking.
When did you feel you disappointed me?
She hesitated, looking at him like he was crazy for not understanding what she meant.
In London. And this morning.
You haven't disappointed me at all. Intrigued me, quite. Disappointed me, certainly not.
Her gaze was so clear, he felt if he stared at her long enough, she just might be able to see his soul. He stood, not trusting himself any longer. Hang her interview. He had to get out of this room.
What is my second warning?
She asked. He ran a slow hand through his hair, concentrating on maintaining his distance when all he really wanted to do was cross the space between them and grab her up by the shoulders. The funny thing was he couldn't be sure what he'd do with her when he got a hold of her. Would he haul her to her feet and scoot the impertinent miss out the door? Or would he hold her lush body against his own and make love to her with his mouth? The latter, of course, startled the hell out of him. He was accustomed to maintaining a certain level of passionate constraint and the things he found himself thinking about lately. Using a finger to loosen his constricting cravat from its stranglehold on his neck, he cleared his throat.
My second word of caution, Miss Haywood. I am unusually capable of persuading others to alter their opinions.
It sounds as if your warning is a disguised threat.
Choose whichever inspires you to behave.
Footsteps echoed in the distance, approaching quickly.
I've returned.
Lady Rosalind called out, rounding the screen.
I brought the sheets, listing the planned events for the entire fortnight, and I...
Her voice trailed off as she glanced at Madelyn.
Are you all right, Madelyn? You're as pink as a kitten's nose.
Yes, quite.
Madelyn answered, her voice small.
She's fine.
Gabriel snapped. Strange, but he hadn't heard his sister open the door.
Well, I for one don't believe you.
She fanned herself with the thin stack of papers in her grasp.
Dreadfully stuffy in here it is. I think we should cut our meeting a little short, don't you agree?
She looked to her brother.
Of course. If Miss Haywood is unwell.
And then his sister nearly yanked the young lady to her feet.
I'll walk back with you.
After she ushered a flushed Miss Haywood in the direction of the door, she turned to glare at her brother over her shoulder.
The poor thing,
she said softly.
What did you do to her?
She didn't wait for an answer and stalked away, catching up to their guest.
What have I done to her?
Gabriel muttered to himself as he crossed the room to crank open a window. Cool air washed over his skin.
What the devil did she do to me?
What is, Papa?